Chapter 11, Author's Conclusion. I have said that Mr. Tilden never married. I may say further of him what Milton wrote on the decease of his most cherished friend Diodati. Thy blush was maiden, and thy youth, the taste of wedded bliss knew never, pure and chaste the honors, therefore, by divine decree the lot of virgin worth, are giving to thee. On 2 separate occasions I received from Mr. Tilden the assurance that he had never had any acquaintance of relations with the female sex, of which he would have hesitated, from motives of delicacy, to speak with his mother or sisters. As Jules Simon said of an illustrious French célibataire, "Il a pas de femmes dans sa vie. Il reste cette grande lacune dans son cœur et dans son talent." Translated Latin to English, there are no women in his life. There remains this great gap in his heart and in his talent. That Mr. Tilden's life would have been more peaceful and fuller of joys had he married, that the affectionate side of his nature would have been more developed and his personality more generally attractive, there is a reason to presume, but that he would have been so great a force in the world as he ultimately became, or that his life would have been so prolonged, may be doubted. The ancients, not without reason, made Venus not only their god of love, but their presiding deity at funerals also, under the name of Libertina. The exceptional longevity of some of the famous anchorites had been attributed in a large degree, and no doubt correctly, to their continence, whereby their whole vigor was concentrated to self-maintenance instead of being expended in 2 directions. The pigeon, say Lord Bacon, lives only 8 years. The mule is much longer lived than the horse or the ass. The nightingale that has young annually, rarely lives more than 6 or 8 years, while the célibataires live on for 20 more. It is a well ascertained fact that hybrid plants live longer than their parents. To be sure, it is not all of life to live nor all of death to die, but a nature so keenly sensible to any genuine tenderness, and physically so dependent from infancy upon others, could have well afforded to surrender a few of the later years of his life, during 3 of which he once told me that he did not remember to have had a single pleasurable emotion, for the love of a sensible woman and the soothing influences of a cheerful domestic fireside. The following distich inscribed over a statue of love is as full of wisdom as of wit. Que tu sois, voici ton maître il lest, le fait ou le doit être. Translated, whoever you are, here is your master, he is, was or should be. Tilden's vital forces, which, in spite of his unrelenting valetudinarianism, were prodigious, which should have been perpetuated in a family, were husband to the last, and as in the case of the poet Pope, Sir Isaac Newton, the philosopher, and especially of some of the famous ascetics of the Christian Church, like Saint Anthony, Theodosius the Cenobite, and Saint Paul the Anchorite, who lived over a century, seemed all to have been derived to the brain and to have induced a cerebral activity and vigor of which the Tilden family tree, so far as it is now possible to trace it, had produced no other example. That he often thought of marrying, that he no aversion to matrimony, and that he never had any relations with the other sex which might interfere with the most solemn engagements which a man can contract with it, no one who knew him well could entertain a doubt. Who you are, your master see, who is, has been, or ought to be. Nor was he in the least degree shy or lacking of ease in the presence of the fair sex. Though reared in an obscure village among plain people, he never at any period of his life betrayed any of that awkward shyness so common with persons unaccustomed to the usages of polite society, nor was there ever a time since he was of age that he would have felt the least embarrassment in the presence of any man or woman, whatever their rank. Like England's great cardinal, though from humble stock, undoubtedly he was fashioned to honor from the cradle. Tilden never married, only because he never felt the need of a wife. His health was always so uncertain, his mind from youth upward was so constantly absorbed with large affairs, public or private, most of the time with both, his temperament was so purely nervous, and women were, so far as he could see, so unimportant to his success in any of the enterprises upon which his heart was set, that marriage never became the subject of leading interest, as it does, for a time at least, with most men whether they marry or not. In fact, he never knew any woman intimately enough to fall completely under the influence of sexual charms. He seemed to have been betrothed in early life to his country, and the Democratic Party occupied with him the place offspring, until it was too late to think of having any other. He was far as possible from sharing the cynical notion of woman proclaimed by Saint Chrysostom, that she was a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic peril, a deadly fascination, and a painted devil, though he might perhaps have agreed with the lover of Eve, that she, as the type of her sex, was fair no doubt and worthy well his cherishing, his honoring, and his love, not his subjection. Had he been elected to the presidency in 1876, Mr. Tilden would probably have contracted a matrimonial alliance, more, however, for the better discharge of the duties of his station than to fill any void in his own scheme of life. Had he in prime married a sensible woman, capable of appreciating his refinement of nature, he would have made a devoted husband and father, though he would have laid a very different and probably much less costly sacrifice upon the altar of his country. Mr. Tilden had no pronounced taste for any of the fine arts, nor did it appear that they ever exerted much influence upon his work or life. He never appeared to care much for music, he never learned to dance. When his fortune permitted him to indulge in luxuries he went occasionally to the play and the opera, but rather to gratify others than for the pleasure he expected to derive from the entertainment. Even in his schooldays his pleasures were all intellectual. He never participated in the athletic games in which his comrades delighted. I doubt if he was ever seen to walk or run very fast. As an antidote to dyspepsia in middle life he got in the way of riding on horseback, but he never learned how to ride or drive, and those who drove with him, while he held the reins, were apt to breathe more freely when they found themselves, if they did, safely set down again at their homes. He liked to get his exercise by riding or driving because his horses did most of the work. He always had fine horses. For one span he paid $10,000, for one of his saddle horses he paid $1,500 and $1,000 for another. He was but partially acquainted with the uses of which hands were capable and for which they were provided. He probably never whittled a stick, tossed a ball, climbed a tree, ran a race, or pulled an oar, nor even carried a cane, except for a few days in Paris under the advice of his physicians as a check to certain arthritic tendencies. Note, in this respect Tilden's experience is not without illustrious precedents. D'Alembert, in his eulogy of Bossuet, the Bishop of Meaux, discountenances the rumor that prelate had been secretly married, on the ground that he had been too much occupied with controversies, absorbed with theological speculations, etc., to be forced to have recourse to such consolations as are to be found in a mutual union of tender and peaceful souls. Il avait plus besoin du combat que de société domestique, et de gloire que d'attachements. Translated Latin to English, he had more need of combat than of domestic society, and of glory than of attachments. He could not be prevailed upon, however, to continue its use. He enjoyed massage because it gave him exercise with exertion. When he established himself at Greystone he surprised his friends by the interest he exhibited and the money he lavished in adding to its attractions. He expended some $75,000 in the construction of glass houses, which he stocked with rare and the costliest growths of many climes, besides compelling them to supply his table with the choicest fruits without much reference to season or climate. He expended about $13,000 in stocking these houses alone. For a single plant indigenous to Mexico he paid $600. He was very proud of a grand old palm reputed to have once belonged to Washington's collection at Mount Vernon. It was between 2 and 3 centuries old. His grapevine plants cost him between $1,300 and $1,400. In the spring of the year immediately preceding his death, he expended over $5,000 in addition to his greenhouse varieties. He also took great pride in his herd of cows and his poultry, upon which he spared no expense to secure the finest breeds to be purchased in his own or any other country. 2 superb St. Bernard dogs were his constant companions in his strolls about his place so long as his limbs allowed him that luxury. To accompany him on his visits to his numerous brute pets was one of the usual privileges, occasionally one of the penalties, attached to his hospitality. While from early youth so economical of his physical functions, he exercised no such economy of his intellectual forces. He seemed to have transferred to his brain all the vitality which he spared his muscles, and to have been as lavish, not to say intemperate, in the use of the one as parsimonious of the other. Whatever he undertook to do he did with all his might. Thoroughness with him amounted to genius. He labored only with his intellect, but with that instrument he never did anything slovenly or by halves. Whether preparing an argument for the courts, reorganizing a corporation, planning a financial operation or a political campaign, he took nothing for granted. He was sometimes accused of being bold to rashness in some of his financial operations, but in point of fact, few men took less risk. Indeed, he took none which study, labor, or expense could avoid. He could not slur work of any kind. The condition of his health often prevented his embarking in enterprises, but it never made him less fastidious about the perfection of those in which he did engage. No matter how feeble he was, he spared neither time, money, nor strength in mastering every detail, in providing for every emergency, in anticipating every contingency. Reference has already been made to this trait in his character, in his preparation for his war upon the Canal Ring, and in some of his important triumphs at the bar. It was equally conspicuous in things of comparatively trivial importance. If he had any responsibility for the decisions, he could not be induced to accept any conclusion but that which he had satisfied himself was the very best, even in matters of trifling moment. I remember when we were crossing over from England to France, in 1877, he asked me at what hotel we should alight in Paris. I named 3 or 4, of which it seemed to me to be a matter of perfect indifference which we chose. This did not suit him. The constitution of his mind compelled him to believe that for some reason or another, one of the hotels must have some advantages for our purposes over either of the others. He ordered his valet to bring him one of his boxes, out of which he took a small library of guide books and maps, and he spent most of the time of our journey between Dover and Paris in ascertaining which of the several dozen first-class hotels in the French metropolis would incontestably answer our purposes best for the 3 or 4 weeks of our proposal's sojourn there. Once when I was present he was waited upon by a gentleman who wished to commend to him a pretty important financial enterprise. The promoter had not been trained in his school. Mr. Tilden asked him a few crucial questions, none of which he could answer with precision. Mr. Tilden dismissed him summarily, and showed considerable irritation at being asked to associate himself in a scheme with a man who knew none of the facts which were necessary to establish even a presumption as to its merits or its demerits. It was this extraordinary crucible to which he subjected everything upon which he passed his judgment which made him always from his youth up, in whatever circle he was placed, whether in the councils of a corporation or in the councils of statesmen, sooner or later the leader and the man to whose guidance his associates found themselves compelled to defer. It is no disparagement to others to say that our country had hitherto produced no one man who appeared to have combined in himself, in the same degree, the essential qualities of a statesman and a politician, nor one so admirable equipped for the most exalted function of both. It was this quality of thoroughness, of always doing his best, to which he was indebted for his ample fortune. His talents justified his ambition from early youth to be a ruler of men, to mature and execute plans for the greatest good of the greatest number. When he found the political career upon which he had embarked interrupted by the schism which divided both the great parties in 1848, he determined to try another mode of acquiring authority among his countrymen. He set his remarkable energies his pecuniary independence, without which he realized that the time had come when the politician was the slave rather than the master. For this the times proved eminently propitious to those who, like Tilden, had the genius to read them aright. But even those advantages without his indefatigable thoroughness would not have enabled him to amass the largest fortune ever acquired by any lawyer in the practice of his profession in this or, so far as I know, in any other country in so brief a period. The malice of political opponents, says Mr. Carter, was wont to ascribe his success in money-getting to schemes for obtaining interests in the property of insolvent railway companies at less than their value. They stigmatized him as a railroad wrecker. Never was there less foundation for a charge. He was a railroad preserver. His skill in the management of difficult and complicated affairs, combined with his profound knowledge of the fundamental principles of equity, made his services invaluable to parties interested in the properties and securities of railroad companies which by bad management, or in consequence of oversanguine expectations, had fallen into difficulties. His capacious mind was just fitted for the survey of such situations. He was among the first, if not the first, to perceive that a ruthless attempt to foreclose the first mortgage, and thus to crush out all subordinate liens and interests was ill-suited to such cases, that the just and true method was to ascertain the real capacities of the business, and to reorganize the enterprise upon a scheme which would indulge the hope of saving to the junior securities a large part of their supposed original value. More than one of the great railroads of the country have, at his skillful touch, risen from absolute bankruptcy into prosperity, and repaid all or the larger part of the original investment. When the making of money was Mr. Tilden's object, he concentrated all his energies upon any money-making enterprise in which he embarked, as completely as when he engaged with the Tweed ring and with the Canal ring. He did not give a few hours a day to business and the rest to pleasure, after the manner of most unsuccessful business men. He took his recreation, if at all, when his work was done and his ends had been achieved. He was so thorough in everything he undertook while in the active practice of his profession, that his services were always in demand and his accumulations rapid. In seeking investments for his earnings he was equally careful and thorough, and was rewarded with corresponding success. Not infrequently he extended to others the benefit of his judgment and enlightened foresight. The results in one of these cases, to which my colleague, Mr. Smith, has called my attention, were quite remarkable. Between the years 1849 and 1868, Miss Catherine Pearson, a maiden lady of Massachusetts and an old friend of the Tilden family, placed in Mr. Tilden's hands at intervals, or authorized him to collect for her, divers sums of money amounting in the aggregate to a little over $74,000. Mr. Tilden attended to the collection and investment of her money without charge even for his expenses, and in September, 1880, when he resigned his stewardship, delivered to her representative registered 4%. United States bonds of the par value of $250,000 and of the market value of about $270,000. To a woman from Michigan, who had asked him near the close of his life to invest some money for her, he, in a few words, gives some pregnant advice which it would be well if women especially would lay to heart. He directed his secretary to say, "Mr. Tilden cannot undertake the charge of the investment you wish to make. He has gradually retired from every such engagement. His advice in respect to the $2,000 is not to lose it by bad investment or to consume it. At 6% it will give you $120 a year, which will keep you from absolute want. You should be careful not to lend it or deposit it with any relation or friend, but should invest it and keep the principal intact." He was no speculator, in the common acceptation of that term. He resented the imputation sometimes made by his political opponents, that he had acquired his large estate by speculations instead of earning it by hard work. He testified a legitimate sensibility upon this point in a letter to Mr. Dorsheimer, who, in his Life of Grover Cleveland, had given currency to this reproach. Dorsheimer had been recommended by Mr. Tilden for the office of lieutenant governor, when he himself was elected governor in 1874. When, in 1876, Mr. Tilden was nominated for the presidency, Mr. Dorsheimer wished to succeed him as governor, and very unwisely, as well as unjustly, held Mr. Tilden responsible for his failure to get the nomination. He was never constituted to be popular with his party, and powerful as Mr. Tilden was in those days, it is extremely doubtful if he could have secured Dorsheimer's nomination had he put forth all his strength to accomplish it, while there is no doubt that it would have been extremely imprudent in him to have done so, even had success been probable. Dorsheimer was weak enough to resent this, and thenceforth walked no more with him, but made an alliance with the anti-Tilden factions in New York City, where, on leaving office, he took up his residence. Some 8 years later, and a few days after Mr. Tilden had written his second letter in June, 1884, declining a renomination to the presidency, which secured the nomination of Mr. Cleveland, Dorsheimer, who had written a campaign life of Mr. Cleveland and was a candidate for favors at his hands, was indiscreet enough to suppose the moment a propitious one to seek a revival of former relations with Mr. Tilden. The following correspondence was the result of it: Dorsheimer to Tilden, Washington, June 29, 1884. My dear Sir, at the time of your brother Henry's death I was on the point of writing to you, but was restrained by some considerations which I do not think necessary to mention. The announcement of your final retirement from public life has again awakened in me a strong desire that our long estrangement should end, and therefore I write to tell you so. And if the memory of our former friendship shall be vivid and pleasing to you as it is to me, I shall not need to make any excuse for intruding upon you. With sincere regards, I am your servant, William Dorsheimer. To the Honorable Samuel J. Tilden. In Mr. Tilden's reply we see, among other things, how he resented the imputation of having accumulated his wealth by speculation. Tilden to Dorsheimer. Greystone, Yonkers, New York. October 8, 1884. Dear Sir, I received with pleasure your letter written after the publication of mine declining renomination for the presidency, and referring to your purpose to have written an earlier one after my brother Henry's death. It should have been answered sooner but for some causes not affecting you or the nature of my reply and which have now passed away. If your reference to an estrangement were designed to imply that any occasion for the same had been given by me, or to imply that any time during the 7 years that have passed I have ever manifested or felt any resentment or any disposition to do you harm, I should be justified in affirming to you the contrary, and even in mentioning that my conduct towards you ought, in a singular degree, to have inspired the opposite sentiments on your part. But I do not doubt that the reference was but another form of words for saying, let bygones be bygones, and so I accept your letter and respond to it in the same spirit in which I believe it to have been written. I have been better able to perceive how much of your time in the interval must have been misspent, since my attention was called to a statement in your biography of Governor Cleveland, that at the time I became interested in the New York Elevated Railroad my fortune had been made by speculation. I could not suppose, with your letter at hand, that in this you designed to say anything disagreeable or unfriendly to me, but it so happens that the statement is an almost total error. My fortune, such as it was the result of professional earnings, of growth of investments intended to be permanent, and of profits of regular business which had been carried on for many years under my personal administration. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Honorable William Dorsheimer, 115 Broadway, New York City. It is but just to Dorsheimer to give his reply which closed their correspondence. Dorsheimer's motives for seeking a reconciliation with Mr. Tilden were not such as to prevent his dancing over the governor's grave when he was no longer an object to be courted or feared, thus furnishing a post-mortem justification for the chilly reception which the governor gave to the professions of friendship with which he had covered his advances. Dorsheimer to Tilden, New York, November 25, 1884. Honorable Samuel J. Tilden, Greystone, Yonkers, New York. My dear Sir, I have not made an earlier reply to your letter, because I could not give the assurance with reference to an allusion to you in my sketch of Mr. Cleveland's life, which circumstances now enable me to give. The publishers propose a new and extended edition of the biography, which will give me an opportunity to correct a phrase referring to you which was used without due consideration. I think it, however, proper to say that had you consulted as familiar an authority as Webster's Dictionary, you would have found that I had some justification for the use of the word speculation, even in view of your own criticism upon it. But I admit that the word has come to have a popular meaning which refers it to such operations as are carried on in Wall Street, that it is not appropriate to apply it to you. The carefully considered passage, which begins on page 131 of the biography, should, I think, have satisfied you that there could have been no purpose to annoy you by the observation of which you complain. Believe me very respectfully, your servant, William Dorsheimer. Mr. Tilden acquired a large fortune, but he earned it by very hard labor and by the exercise of those qualities which commonly ensure success. He was always frugal in his expenditures and simple in his habits. He contracted no obligations which he was not always perfectly competent and ready to meet, and he was extremely cautious to make no promises nor to authorize any expectations which he did not loyally respect. During the 15 or 16 years which were pretty exclusively devoted to his profession, he was justly proud of being able to say that he never accepted a contingent fee, that he never made a bargain in advance for the price of his services, that he never had any controversy with a client about the value of his services, which were rendered, on his client's own estimate and as we have already shown, usually for less than an ordinary broker's commission, but in a single instance, and in that the justice of his claim was eventually admitted. The money thus honorably and judiciously invested placed him in a condition of pecuniary independence which rendered him entirely inaccessible to those influences which not infrequently impair the usefulness of the most gifted men. Though as far as possible from indulging that spirit of self-righteousness on which there is a class of politicians more or less numerous always trading, Tilden never gave his confidence to men engaged in politics, for what there was in it, albeit as a party leader sometimes obliged to cooperate with them, and it would be easy to name many prominent men who he quietly assisted in dropping from public life, because of their tendency to sacrifice the interests of their party or country to their personal greed, vanity, or ambition. The predatory habits which this tendency fostered among politicians he regarded, and no doubt correctly, as one of the most deplorable results of our Civil War. At the public dinner at Delmonico's, on the 8th of February 1869, Charles O'Connor in the chair, Mr. Tilden expressed himself with much feeling upon this subject. I may in early life have been disposed to censure extreme ambition. If so, I have unlearned the sentiment when I behold how much worse, in all its influences and all its consequences, is the spirit of venality in public affairs. Immense applause. I have often felt, of late years, that I would thank God if there would arise men with a generous devotion to the pursuit of ambition in the public councils, so that thus politics would cease to be the theater of the votaries of gain, and that human nature, even in its selfishness, would be present its more generous and more useful forms. Applause. I think the time will speedily come when among good citizens of all parties and all classes this will be urged as the great need of the time, and when we may meet together and discuss our differences of opinion, our differences of sentiment, and entertain charity for those vagaries which it is impossible for us not to have, remembering that this human society of which we form a part can only get on when our public servants are faithful, single-minded, and pure in their public trusts. And to them we all, of all classes, of all parties, and of all degrees, must unite in rendering one homage. In early life Mr. Tilden was a very careful student of the history of the first Napoleon, and I have heard him say that nothing would have suited him so well as a military career. That he was a born general, and at the head of an army would have made a place for himself among the great soldiers of the world, had the opportunity been afforded him, I have no difficulty believing. He was sometimes accused of indecision and of wasting opportunities in deliberation. I think this a superficial criticism. He decided promptly enough when all the elements for a decision were in his possession or under his control, or when more was to be accomplished by decision than delay. He was not constitutionally a Fabian general, but he was a Fabius when the war he was prosecuting required Fabian generalship. He sometimes disappointed his political partisans by declining to adopt their views, but events generally proved that it was because he saw much farther than they. Political forces are not all under the control of a party leader in the same degree that the forces of an army are under the control of its general, and what seemed indecision in him was often, if not always, prudence, good judgment, and an uncommonly correct appreciation of the value of time as an ally. When he said, "Not yet," it always meant that he was waiting for the reserves which time was bringing to his aid. His confidences, says Mr. Carter, very truly, were not effusive, nor their subjects numerous. His deliberation was unfailing, and sometimes carried the idea of indecision, not to say of an actual love of procrastination, but in my experience with him I found that he invariably ended where he began, and it was never difficult for those to whom he gave his trust to divine at once the bias of his mind when he thought it best to reserve its conclusions. I do not think that in any great affair he ever hesitated longer than the gravity of the case required of a prudent man, or that he had a preference for delays, or that he clung over tenaciously to both horns of the dilemma, as his professional training and instincts might lead him to do, and did certainly expose him to the suspicion of doing. I accompanied Mr. Tilden to the theatre one evening in the spring on 1877. He had been delving at his leisure for some weeks in Carlyle's Letters and Speeches of Cromwell, prompted thereto originally, perhaps, by the traditional kinship of his ancestry with that of the great usurper. When we returned I made the following memoranda of his conversation upon the theme which just then seemed to interest him far more than the play. Tilden's has been reading Carlyle's Cromwell, and in connection various biographies of C. in his library, and monographs. He says he does not remember to have had his views of any eminent man more seriously modified by reading about him than his about Cromwell. He is specially impressed with the man's moderation, sagacity, and general superiority. He seems to have considered and provided everything that was required for the success of the revolution he conducted. He recurred to the subject repeatedly in the course of the evening and after we returned from the theatre. He was constantly viewing Cromwell from his own standpoint. He remarked that Cromwell had a religious fanaticism to aid him in controlling his partisans, which had far more cohesive power than any of the ordinary political discontents which operate upon parties now. He also noticed that Cromwell began his revolution with money raised exclusively by subscription, a thought suggested no doubt by the excuses assigned by some of his friends for not insisting upon our rights in Washington at all hazards, because the state legislatures in all the northern and middle states were Republican. Knowing, as I did, the situation which attracted Tilden's attention to the study of Cromwell's career at this period, I could not help thinking that if Tilden were as badly disposed a man as the Republican press represented him during the late canvass, how dangerous he might have been. It was the thoroughness with which he mastered every detail, forecast every contingency, and by his precautions, as it were, defied the fates, that made him always and everywhere primus inter pares, that impressed Mr. Carter with his prodigious superiority to other men. And which, mutatis mutandis, might have made him as famous a leader in the field as in the council chamber, for he had few adventitious advantages. He had no particular charm of person, he always looked the invalid he was, he had no special graces of manner, nor was he eloquent of speech. The effect of his oratory was due exclusively to the things he said, not to the way he said them. He would spend more days over a paper designed for the public eye than most men would spend hours. It mattered not how many other things were pressing upon his attention, nor what the condition of his health at the time, he would never permit a paper to go out of his hands until he had made its positions as nearly impregnable as it was possible for him to make them. Though perfectly just toward an adversary, he never neglected a fair advantage. His logic was sure to be irresistible, and every statement of fact susceptible of verification. He never made public use of rumors or presumptions or suspicions. He left them on the tree where they grew till they ripened or rotted. He was not fluent, his first draft of paper was to its ultimate appearance but as clay to porcelain. He was indefatigable in altering and perfecting. He rarely, I think it would be safe to say that he never, sent a paper to the press that he did not submit to 2 or 3 or more friends as a sort of jury of his countrymen for the purpose of gathering from their criticism whether what he had written was likely to leave upon the public mind the impression he intended to leave. He had not the least pride of authorship, and was as ready to avail himself of the suggestions of others as to adhere to his own, indeed rather more, for it was the public which they represented, not himself, who he wished to impress. His judgment of words or forms of expression that weaken or strengthen a sentence was infallible. He never allowed himself the use of expressions not idiomatic or which the plainest people would stumble over. As a negotiator Mr. Tilden was a marvel. He always began by making himself acquainted with the merits and strength of both sides, and he fought only for the margin. He never lost his temper, though he sometimes affected to do so, nor the control of his tongue. I have rarely known a man of eminence in public life who was less censorious, or whose judgments were at once more inflexible towards the sin and at the same time so charitable towards the sinner. Whether systematically or unconsciously, he always dealt with his friends as if they might some day become his enemies, and with his enemies as if they might become his friends, the results of both which he had frequent experience. As a consequence, it was never embarrassing for him to enter into correspondence and relations with his adversaries whenever any adequate object for doing so presented itself. Thought holding more or less familiar relations with Mr. Tilden for a period of more than 50 years, I should find it very difficult to recall a half-dozen instances in which he allowed himself to apply an opprobrious epithet to or speak of any one in terms which, if repeated, would have disturbed their relations with each other. Were any one the object of denunciations in his presence, he was apt to make some remark which disqualified their author for assuming from his silence that he acquiesced in their justice. It was also a rare thing for anyone to leave him without feeling that in one way or another his acquaintance was an important asset. As the leader of a great party, he was compelled to enter into relations with all sorts and conditions of men. Many people eschew cooperation with those of low degree and of questionable character, as frequently from selfish as from virtuous motives. Mr. Tilden appropriated force wherever he found it, for he had no fear of being overreached by any one. He used men of low standards for his purposes when they could be made useful, but never exhibited contempt for those who did not choose to follow him. This gave him a prodigious influence for good with the classes most dangerous to society when not properly led. He usually managed to divide those he could not control, so that they should waste their energies upon each other, leaving him the comparatively easy task of holding and wielding the balance of power between them. It was in this way that he rendered Tammany Hall practically powerless, when under leadership factions it as bent upon mischief. There were 2 principles of leadership upon which he often dwelt in conversation and which were peculiarly his own. One was a generous recognition of the part which the imagination exercises upon the tidal ebbs and flows of public opinion, and the other was the importance of keeping his party constantly in the presence of the enemy. He regarded the imagination of a nation as of an individual, much as the furnace to a steamer. It must be carefully fed, and the force it generates wisely directed. Disaster is sure to follow the neglect of either of these conditions. There was something dramatic, appealing directly to the imagination, in everything he did, upon which his fame either as a lawyer or as a statesman rests. For example, the manner in which he reconstructed the tallies fraudulently destroyed in the Flag case, and won it without calling a single witness or having a witness to call, the manner in which he proved in the Burdell case that the clergyman had actually married another woman than the one he supposed and swore he had married. The manner in which he possessed himself of the evidence by which he overthrew the Tweed ring at the moment when it seemed most securely entrenched, and sent Tweed and his confederates into exile or prison, the manner in which, no one suspecting what he was about, he procured the evidence upon which he trailed his guns upon the Canal ring, morally and politically the most important of all his victories. And finally, the triumphant manner in which he used the hold he had already acquired upon the popular imagination to carry off the presidential nomination from the numerous and impatient aspirants in and out of Congress, in 1876. In all these cases the part he played was more or less unique, and so managed as to appeal, as no other Democratic statesman since Jackson's time had done, strongly to the imagination, not only of his own state, but of the whole nation. He believed also in keeping his party always under arms, and in or ready for a fight, upon the same principle that a good general always keeps his troops, or the captain of an ocean steamer his sailors, fully employed. An army has no reason for existing without an enemy. He held the same to be true with a party. The very name implies an adversary and hostility. The duty of the leader is to keep the hostile energy distinctly in view of his followers, and in leading his followers to expect every moment, and to be always prepared to profit by, an advantageous opportunity of assailing it. A party thus led does not clamor for bipartisan commission, and the voice of the dealer is not heard in its camp. He liked praise, but it never seemed to mislead him, for he judged his own achievements most impartially. He liked praise when he felt himself entitled to it, but he did not purchase it for more than it was worth. Flattery is the homage consciously or unconsciously paid to some kind of superiority. Of that he received in abundance, but no one better than he knew the difference between flattery and honest commendation. He was intensely pleased with what O'Connor said of his part in the Flag case, and was fond of repeating it, as he might be, for though a junior counsel to the two most eminent lawyers then at the New York bar, to him belonged the entire credit of winning a case of almost national importance, which, but for his ingenious defense, would unquestionably have been lost. Though he conducted his business on business principles, and never allowed it to be confounded with his charities, he was a liberal giver. Aside from his contributions to party purposes, which after he became chairman of the State Central Committee were usually as large and often larger than those of any other person to the end of his days, no one was ever allowed to go empty away, who represented a cause or an object which commended itself to his judgment. Mr. Tilden experienced religion at the age of 19, when he and his sister Mary were simultaneously admitted as members of the Presbyterian Church in New Lebanon. He owned a pew in the Madison Square Presbyterian Church in New York City for many years, and up to the time of his death, where he was in the habit of attending service until he took up his residence, as governor, in Albany. There he attended the church of which Chancellor Upson was pastor, pretty regularly. When he resumed his residence in New York, in 1877, his infirmities rendered it first embarrassing and afterwards painful to submit to the constraints of a house of worship during the ordinary Sabbath exercises. He rarely, if ever, attended divine service in any church after that year. Mr. Tilden used to quote a remark of Bryant, who I suspect borrowed it from Chesterfield, that a gentleman never talks of his love affairs or his religion. Tilden at least lived up to this principle. He had no love affairs to talk of, and while he often encouraged others to unfold their opinions upon religious subjects to him, I doubt if at any time during the last half of his life he exposed his own views to any one. The Bible could hardly be regarded as a lamp to his feet and a light to his path. If it was, it must have been by virtue of the lessons he received from it in early youth, when he undoubtedly acquired as thorough a familiarity with its contents as he was qualified to receive. But the Bible is a fountain, not a reservoir, and though one may carry the words, he can no more carry all the lessons of the Bible in his memory, than he can warm himself in winter with the summer's heat. When devoutly read, it is a new book every day, for the import of those lessons to every one changes with every change of his spiritual condition. Had Mr. Tilden studied it as he studied the other subjects which engrossed his attention in later life, he might perhaps have found shorter and easier ways out of many of his troubles, and have experienced many more pleasurable emotions in his declining years. But though apparently little occupied with the dogmas for which the different religious sects find pretext in the Bible, Mr. Tilden was profoundly penetrated and permeated by its ethics, and in many ways betrayed the tenacity of his early faith in their divine origin and authority. Whatever may be the judgment which history is to pass upon the career of a hero of this imperfect narrative, it will search in vain to find in the political annals of this republic the names of many who ever rendered it such effective and enduring service, nor of those, any whose service costs it so little. End of this chapter. Please like and subscribe to the Tilden Biography channel. Feel free to share with others who enjoy our history. America's Gilded Age was a fascinating time period in our country's history. Note from producer. Samuel Tilden was elected our real 19th president, and evidence proves this in Appendix A. It details the facts of case by the 4 states involved: Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. Tilden's biggest fear was corruption left unchecked would spread nationwide, and it has on every level in the 20th and 21st centuries. Samuel had 2 powerful statements to encourage future generations: "When the people rise, the system gets cleansed," and "I trust the people," engraved on his statue, and "I still trust the people," engraved on his tombstone. These are words from a great statesman who had integrity and believed in we the people.